Welcome back to the Collaborative IEP podcast. I'm Ashley Barlow, your host, and I am so happy you are here. We're going to continue into our dive into UFLI, the University of Florida Literacy Institute reading instruction. And we're going to start off with a funny story. So last Monday, I got a text from a friend that said, "Did you say that Jack Barlow gets Orton Gillingham every day at school? I'm trying to get a mom OG at school every day, one-on-one for 30 minutes, and the school is saying that's too much. And they really want to use their own program called UFLI. Have you heard of UFLI?" Now, I read that to you verbatim because I get that text message from an advocate or attorney friend, like at least twice a month, but probably more often than that. And this one was just so timely because I was like, we're literally recording podcast episodes about that. So I was like, one came out already, one's coming out tomorrow, and I've got another one next week. And so I really thought that was funny. But that's just indicative of how needed this topic is. So, what we're going to do today is we are going to continue talking about UFLI. I'm going to pull up that daily lesson plan, and then I'm going to go through the links that give you the tools that UFLI has online so that you can really kind of understand what the instruction looks like. And possibly, if you want to, you can work on this stuff with your child at home. So, this is when the collaboration comes in. I highly recommend that you either work with your child at home or that you get some kind of outside services, whether that's tutoring or you have a sibling work with your child or something, so that you've got some other data point. And that way you can say, hey, this is what we're learning at home. These are the insights that we have, etc. You also can use it kind of receptively or reactively. If school reports a problem with instruction, you can be like, well, this is the way that we see that because you have the insight from working on it at home or elsewhere in the community. So you can use experiences and working with your kid and keeping data proactively and reactively. Relative to that, I will say one little aside here first, and that is I have had a fair amount of districts that have gotten mad about proactive advocacy. Not mad, but have been like, stay in your lane recently. And so I want to remind you, parents, that you are part of a team and that the development of the IEP and the implementation of the IEP are both within your lane. And so maybe we need to change the way that we say things. Maybe we need to change the frequency that we communicate or the volume of information that we communicate, etc. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be communicating about the implementation of the IEP. And it certainly doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved in our child's educations. So I like to take that feedback humbly and say, okay, I say to my client, okay, they don't want for you to do it this way. So let's try to do it in a different way, but you still have to stay involved because that is key to the success of your child. So just a little heads up, I'm getting a lot of that this fall, and I don't know where it's coming from, honestly, because that is not something that I have to counsel clients through super duper often, but it seems like a trend right now. All right. So, what we're going to do is I've got the little lesson plan up, and I am going to walk you through a few things in the lesson plan. So, the first thing that they have is this blendable sounds modeling video that I will walk you through. And then they have a blending board tutorial, and we learn about their blending board. And then we have their word work mat, which is also kind of like a blending board, but I'll walk you through that as well. And then we're going to move on. Okay. So this is the UFLI planning and implementation support. I will again put this in the show notes for those of you that are just listening. And we're not going to go back through all of the steps and like explain them again. But as you will remember from last week, step 1 is phonemic awareness. There's no link. Step 2 is visual drill. There is no link. Step 3 is auditory drill, and we get this video over here on blendable sounds. So I'm going to click on that. I don't think the audio will come through, but I want to, well, it starts with a commercial because I just opened it up. But I want to show you how easy it is. When you click on some things that are like, the teacher has to model, blah, 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 it comes up with these really quick videos. So this video, I think, is about like 7 minutes long if you got through the commercial, and it would show you how they model the blending sounds. If you watch this for your child, if you've got 7 minutes to do that, it will probably give you some insights. An insight that I had when UFLI was being proposed to work with my child was, he does better with manipulatives than with on-screen stuff, because then he kind of gets obsessed with the on-screen stuff like so many kids do. So he does better without technology. And I said, but also Jack Barlow likes stuff. Super nuanced thing about Jack, but he is, like, the psychological term, I think, is satiated by a lot of stuff. So anything that comes in multiples, like popsicle sticks and Legos and anything like that, he likes to hoard. And so I said, since he likes stuff, I would definitely print him on cardstock, because he's going to be hard on him. He's going to want to carry those cards around. He's going to want his own copy of the cards. He's going to want them. So make them durable, right? So just little things that you can provide insight on that will help the school team do what they're doing. Now, you also can just let it happen, but then you're going to have 2 weeks of them. In my case, I would have 2 weeks of them fighting over the stuff when they could make him his own thing of them, and they could be ready for him, ready to go. So I just wanted to show you how quick and easy it is to see that stuff. And I do think these are pretty efficient, which could help you. So the next thing is in step 4 is the blending drill, and you get the blending board app. Now you can click over here and get a blending board tutorial, and it shows you how to use the blending board. I'm going to pull it up for you though, so that you can see what the blending board looks like. You're going to see a bunch of letters on the left-hand side. It kind of looks like a keyboard, and those are blue. And then you're going to see vowels in the middle, and those are red. And you're going to see additional consonants on the left, and those are green. And then you're going to see a pink E at the end. And I bet you can guess what that pink E is. It's in case you want to add magic E, or the E at the end of a word in order to make the vowel sound long, like Mike and plate and rake, those kinds of words. So you'll remember when we did the blending board last week that I have the MZ cards, and those go on kind of a wooden stand, and you flip them down in order to have the students blend sounds together to make real words and nonsense words. And so we went through a thing where we read log, and then we took the L away and we put an F up, and we read fog, and then we took the O away and we made it an I, and we read fig, and then we took the G away and we made it an M, and we read sim, even though that's a nonsense word. It's not a real word. Okay. So this is the same concept, only this can be done with this blending board online. So what you can do is you can click a letter. I just clicked a B, and then I can click an A, and then I can click a P, and I can make the word BAP. And so what you would do with the student is you would say BAP, BAP. And then we might change the P at the end to a G, and you just click on the G and it automatically switches over to bag, right? So then you would take them through it again though. B-ag, bag. And then you might change the beginning to a G, and then you have gag, and then you change the vowel to an O, and you have gog. And you keep going through these things in order to just really practice the sounds. Now, one thing that you might be saying is, I thought that this was supposed to be sequential, and it is. So what if you haven't done all of these letters? This is when it takes a little bit more teacher supervision and teacher preparation, because the system isn't set up to go sequentially. The teacher has to ensure that it's sequential. Now, I will tell you that it does in that lesson plan say, make sure you're only doing sounds that you have already done before. And in the fidelity checklist, everywhere along the way, it says the teacher has only done sounds that the students have already learned. But it's not as foolproof as those MZ cards, which have numbers and instructions on the back of them. So it does take a little bit more teacher supervision and teacher awareness in order to make sure that you get it correct. But I will point out that over here there are 3 lines, and you can choose which letters you get. So in the beginning, when you're first starting off with letters, what you would do is you would deselect all of them at the beginning, and you would only do the letter sounds that your students knew. So you would do, just whatever they are, B, M, G, H. I don't know what they are, and I don't have the scope and sequence memorized. But basically, you look where you are in the scope and sequence, and then you add to it. You'll remember when we talked about one difference between MZ and Orton Gillingham, I pulled up my phoneme grapheme chart and said, one thing that I loved about MZ is when I work with a student, it's really fun to highlight a sound and say, now we've done this sound and look at this huge paper. And someday you're going to know all of these sounds. Well, you could also do that here because they can see what is selected. So after you learn a new sound, you could be like, okay, now we're going to go over to our blending board and we're going to add in, look, now we know all the vowels and we can add all of the vowels to our blending board. Okay. But then it also continues in the scope and sequence where you start to get some diagraphs and some blends. And, like when you learn doubling rules, you'll probably learn FF, LL, SS, and ZZ together. So then you get to add all of those at once, and that's really fun. And then you would come back to your blending board and you would be able to include those words. So let's just say that that's the first rule you learned. I'll show you an example over here. Let's say that you have all of the 26 letters, which I think in UFLI is 43 lessons to get through the first 26 letters plus Magic E. And then let's say the next thing you learned was that doubling rule. I don't think it is, but just for the sake of example here. By the way, the doubling rule in MZ is called Sammy Loves Friendly Zebras because it's SS, LL, FF, ZZ. Like, those are sounds that you double at the end of words, and there's a rule for it. So then you come back to the blending board and you'll see that you have those initial 26 letters, and then you also have available to you Sammy Loves Friendly Zebras. So you can just make a word like MAFF, math. It's not a word, but you see that you can, it's a nonsense word, but you see that you can add those in there. Okay. So that's how the blending board works in UFLI. And that's a really cool tool and strategy to utilize. It's just, number one, it's electronic. And so you need to know that. And number two, it takes a little bit more work in order to ensure that it is sequential. Okay, so finishing the blending drill, utilizing that blending board app, then takes you to step 5 of the daily lesson, which is introduction of the new concept. Now, on the lesson plan, there is not a click over to that because those come out of things that they call lesson guides. So there is a toolbox on the UFLI website, UFLI Foundations Toolbox. And inside that, there are the lessons. I went ahead and found that Sammy Loves Friendly Zebras lesson. That's not what they call it. That's what MZ calls it. But I found that FLSZ spelling rule. You can download it as a PowerPoint or Google Slides. And I have the Google Slides up for you. So we're going to go in order, which has a little bit of review here, because for every single lesson inside UFLI, there are these slides. So a lot of parents are like, how do I know it's explicit? How do I know it's sequential? Well, a good question to ask is, do you use the slides that are on UFLI's website, or do you use something else? If you use something else, you're going to have a lot more questions, right? And I'm teaching you the nuanced questions to ask about it. If you use the UFLI slides, you can tell it's sequential because they're only going to give you the sounds that you know. And you can tell it's explicit, at least according to UFLI, because they made it. So it's going to deliberately go through the curriculum. And so you'll see on the first slide, it says, here's our schedule. We're going to do phonemic awareness. Then we're going to do the visual drill. Then we're going to do the auditory drill. And then we're going to do blending. And then I'm going to teach you the new concept. Okay. And there's a slide for each of those. So there's a slide for phonemic awareness. And then there's even back to the schedule. Check, we did that. A slide for visual drill. And you get all the sounds that they give you for the visual drill even. And those are just in your PowerPoint. So you don't have to think about what letters you've gotten before. And then there's a slide that says, check, we did the visual drill. Now we're going to do the auditory drill. Here's a slide for that. And so there's a blank slide to do the auditory drill on if teachers have a smartboard that they can write on. And then you check that off. And then the blending drill, that's what you would go over to the blending board for. And you come back to that. And then you come to a new concept. So when they teach the new concept, what's going to happen is they're going to teach using these slides. Now, what I think is really interesting is there is no lesson that teaches you how to teach this concept. So in MZ, you learn the rule. And in your teacher's guide, the rule is stated again. That is not here in the UFLI slides. I am certain that you can find that in one of the videos, but the teacher is going to have to educate themselves on what that is. There's no like speaker notes or anything else. I played all around with these slides and I don't see any place else in the slide, which is called the toolbox, that teaches the teacher what the rule is for when you double an F, an L, an S, or a Z at the end of a word. But at least we have a slide saying F goes to FF, L goes to LL, and so on. And then we see a sentence, Jeff will pass Buzz, which is probably a way that UFLI suggests that you remember that. And we have a slide that talks about where those sounds are made in our mouths. So F, we have our teeth over top of our lips, and there's a visual. L, our tongue goes to the top of our mouth towards our teeth. S, our tongue goes up against our teeth and our lips go wide. And Z is the same thing, only that is a voiced sound. So, and Z, our tongue and mouth are in the same position, but one is voiced and one is not voiced. So we have those. We even have a little like voice box, volume on and volume off thing so that we can see where they are. So that's part of the explicit nature of it. But again, there aren't instructions for the teacher to know how to do that. But then it does say, let's write together. And then we have words that we can read together and words that we can spell together. And then we check off the new concept. So somewhere along the line, there has to be some information on how to get that spelling rule down. I just don't see it quickly in that lesson toolbox. And I think that's an important thing. So, I would ask the teacher, where do you learn all of these different concepts? Where do you learn the spelling rules and the rules about how to break down words? Because I think that's an important question. Then the only other thing that is in the lesson planning and implementation support is this thing called a word work map. And like I said, it is very similar to a blending app, but let's look at it and see what it looks like. You can get a beginning one or an intermediate one. And so what it is it is a list of all of the letter sounds, as well as digraphs and blends and vowel teams and vowels, etc. And then at the top, there are these boxes. And so what you can do is you can drag those sounds into the boxes in order to make words. So if you wanted to make the word phone, for example, you would pull up the digraph PH, and that is color coded so that PH always goes together, O-N-E. And so then you would blend that together, phone. And then you could, pretend like feign was a word, and you could drag an A over top of the O and make it a feign, and so on. So, and they can simply clear their boards. So the students could download this or go to this website and do this themselves. But the way that it is shown and demonstrated by MZ, there is a video on this one as well, is that the teacher would pull those up and would go through them, and they would work together on those sounds. Now, interestingly, when the teacher does it on the video, you can tell she's looking down at a list of words. I can't find any place where there are lists of words for teachers to do in the individual lessons to make sure that they're spiraling and going back and hitting old concepts in the past. So again, I just think UFLI has a little more teacher discretion, and that is both nice because it keeps it flexible, but it's a little bit harder because it makes a little bit more work on the teacher. But I wanted for you to be able to see what that looks like in action as well. Now, the last thing on the lesson plan is connecting it to text. So this is when the teacher directs the students to read words and sentences, and then directs them to write words and sentences, and then you do a decodable reader. The decodable readers there's no link in that lesson plan, but if you go back out to the toolkit, there is a passage or a column for the decodable passages. And so I downloaded the lesson 42, which is that Sammy Loves Friendly Zebras, the FLSZ decodable reader, and theirs is called Buzz Sells Milk. And so you will see that there is one passage on one piece of paper that is called Buzz Sells Milk. And it says, Buzz has a fun job. His job is to sell jugs of milk at the mill. Buzz runs up a tall grass hill to get the milk, blah, 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 blah. Okay. It is a nice big font, and it is, it looks easy enough to read. I am no expert in what font is right and what size is right and all of that stuff, but it does look like it's easy enough to read. The one thing that I would say that's very different from MZ is it's all on one page. And in the MZ curriculum, they are books, which is a little bit exciting, and it's less intimidating because you know how it is sometimes when you pull up a big, long, like a lot of words on one piece of paper, your kid's like, ah. But if they're separated onto different pages of a whole book, then they are less intimidated. This might be intimidating to some students. Also, there's no pictures. The students are tasked with illustrating the story. That might be a way to modify, is to, even have AI generate a picture for it, because, some students are not super motivated to illustrate. And I'm certain that the reason why, first of all, it's just fun for some kids, but also they don't want to looking at the picture for context. So that then is the decodable reader, and that's the end of that lesson plan. So I'm trying to get back over to it. I'm sorry, I'm clicking around in here. So the connected text is step 8 of day 2 on the lesson plan, and therefore we have now gone through all of the resources that are in that lesson plan on the UFLI website. Okay, we will pause here and we will circle back, and I'm going to give you a list of questions that you can ask when UFLI is being discussed in your IEP teams, so that you can ensure that you are comfortable with the reading program that your child is going to get. Okay, so the most obvious are, you can ask specifically about the OG principles, right? You can say, I know that UFLI has not gotten the stamp of approval from Orton Gillingham. However, let's talk about the principles of Orton Gillingham so that I ensure that the way that you propose implementing UFLI checks the boxes of Orton Gillingham. So explicit, systematic, diagnostic and prescriptive, multisensory, is it individualized, is it direct and explicit? Those questions, right? So look at those characteristics of UFLI and ask, does it meet those criteria? I would also definitely ask about teacher training. So, what training has my student's particular teacher received in UFLI? And do they have training in broader OG principles? So, Orton Gillingham Academy or MZ or Wilson or something like that, so that they understand how to adapt the instruction if UFLI is not sufficient in and of itself. I would feel very comfortable if they had OG Academy or MZ training because that is, in my own personal experience, more comprehensive, at least for now. And that's what I'm saying in September of 2025. Then I would ask specifically about the child. So, is UFLI aligned with the needs of my child, with their dyslexia, with their reading, with their general academic and functional profile? Have you had students with similar profiles succeed using UFLI? I would definitely make sure that you feel very comfortable with the goals and the other data monitoring processes. So, in most programs, students have to achieve a certain percentage on like a Friday test in order to move on to the next skill. So, how are you going to know whether or not to advance my child to the next skill, the next lesson? And what are you going to do if you need to reinforce at the end of a week? In addition to IEP goals, are there other things that you're going to be monitoring, and how can I get access to those? How will that data be collected? How often will it be collected? How will it be shared? Questions like that. Certainly, you want to ask about the frequency or the intensity of the intervention. So, how many minutes per day, times per week will my student get the UFLI instruction? I usually wanna know if it's in small group or one-on-one, and I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both, and it really, also depends on the student. Mm, and then I would wanna know about fidelity, right? So how does the district ensure that fidelity is being met, and who oversees that fidelity? Are you going through that fidelity checklist that's online, and how do we know that there is fidelity? And then supplementing. So, I just hung up with a client whose child is getting Barton and said that they were so much further ahead in Barton than they were at school. And I was like, well, it seems to me like Barton might be advancing really fast, but they probably aren't supplementing Barton. And so are we able to generalize that in order to ensure that like we really have that solid? So the question with UFLI is, if UFLI alone isn't addressing my child's needs, what program or programs or materials can you use to supplement it? So I hope that helps. To me, it felt like a deep dive. I had to, tootle in and out of lots of spaces on the UFLI website more than I have in the past. But like I said, I've been doing it for a few clients. And so I was certainly happy to do it for you all. So I think that wraps up our three-part series on UFly. But if you have any additional questions or need any additional information, don't hesitate to reach out to me because I'm happy to record additional episodes and tack them back onto this little series anytime. But for now, I will see you next week, same time, same place.